She sat at that restaurant for 2 hours, table for two, candles lit, water glass refilled 3 times. The chair across from her, empty. Her phone showed one message, 4 words. Meeting running long, sorry. She ate alone, paid the bill, went home. What she didn't know, what nobody told her, was that her husband, one of the most powerful men in 3 countries, was sitting in a restaurant on the other side of the world, with another woman, the whole time, not doing what you think. Something far more dangerous than that. Because in 7 Days in Seoul, Rafael Moro, a man who had never needed anyone, never depended on anyone, never let anyone close enough to see the real version of him, met a woman who understood him in a way his wife of 18 years had stopped doing long ago. She didn't seduce him. She didn't manipulate him. She simply listened, translated, and showed him the one thing no amount of money or power had ever shown him before, what he had been missing, and who he had been becoming without realizing it. This is not a story about betrayal. This is a story about what happens when a man who controls everything finally meets the one thing he cannot control. There are men born to dominate every room they walk into. Men who built empires not from luck, but from thinking differently than everyone around them. This channel is not about crime. This channel is about mindset, about the kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself, and about the secrets behind real power that no classroom will ever teach you. If that's the world you want to understand, you're in the right place. Here's what this story will leave with you. The most dangerous distance in any relationship is not physical. It's the distance between two people sitting at the same table who have quietly stopped translating for each other, stopped really listening, stopped meaning what they say. Rafael Moro learned that lesson not at home, but 10,000 miles away, in a city where he couldn't speak the language, completely dependent on a stranger to tell him what the world around him actually meant. And in losing control of the language, he found something he hadn't known he'd lost. That is the lesson. The most powerful version of yourself is not the one who needs nothing. It's the one who is honest enough to recognize what and who actually matters. If this story hit something real in you, hit the like button. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's one relationship in your life where you stopped really listening? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe because the next story is already waiting.
There is a table by the window at Maria Restaurant on the Upper West Side of Manhattan that Elena Moro had eaten at more times than she could count. She knew the way the candlelight hit the white tablecloth at 8 in the evening. She knew the sound the sommelier made when he uncorked a bottle of something expensive. She knew the particular quality of silence in that room, the kind that only expensive restaurants achieve, where the noise of the city outside is replaced by the soft murmur of people who have enough money to speak quietly. She had been sitting at that table for 1 hour and 47 minutes. The chair across from her was empty. Her water glass had been refilled 3 times. The young server knew, still learning how to read a room, had asked twice whether she would like to order. Both times she had said not yet. The third time he came around, she saw him glance at the empty chair and look quickly away. And she recognized that look. She had seen it before, the polite pretending not to notice. She picked up her phone. No new messages. The last one, received at set 15, read, "Meeting running long. Sorry, don't wait. 4 words and a period. No explanation of which meeting. No estimate of how much longer. Just those 4 words and the period at the end, which somehow felt more final than a period had any right to feel." Elena set the phone face down on the white tablecloth. She was 43 years old. She had dark hair that she wore up on evenings like this one, and she had the kind of face that people called beautiful in a way that meant they also thought it was serious. She did not look like a woman who had been waiting for almost 2 hours. She looked like a woman who had chosen to eat alone and was perfectly comfortable with that choice. That was the thing about 18 years of practice. You got good at it. She signaled the server and ordered the sea bass, a glass of the vermentino she liked. And for a moment before the server walked away, she looked at the empty chair one more time. She did not let herself wonder where he was. She had learned, a long time ago, not to wonder. On the other side of the world, in a restaurant in the Gangnam district of Seoul, South Korea, Raphael Moro was sitting across a table from a woman named Claire Morgan. It was noon in Seoul. Documents were spread across the table between them. 2 glasses of mineral water, not wine. This was not a romantic dinner. It looked exactly like what it was: two professionals working through a briefing for a meeting the following morning. But anyone watching Raphael Moros closely would have noticed something. He was paying attention. Not the polite attention of a man enduring a presentation, not the strategic attention of a man gathering information. Real attention. The kind where you lean forward slightly without realizing you're doing it. The kind where you stop thinking about what you're going to say next and just listen to what the other person is saying right now. He had not paid attention like that in a long time. His phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. He saw his wife's name. He turned the phone face down on the tablecloth. Claire was still talking. She was walking him through the cultural protocols for tomorrow's meeting, the specific register of required. When addressing a Korean businessman of Chairman Sterling's generation, the words to use and the words to absolutely avoid, the way silence functioned differently in Korean negotiation than it did in American or Italian business culture. She was 33 years old with dark hair cut short, and the kind of precise, economical way of speaking that belonged to someone who had spent years understanding that every word cost something. She did not use words carelessly. Raphael picked up his phone with one hand while still looking at Claire. Typed quickly, set it back down. In New York, Elena's phone buzzed. Meeting running long. Sorry, don't wait. She read it, set it face down. Neither of them knew it yet. But the story had already begun. Rafael Moro had built his life on control. He controlled the rooms he walked into. He controlled the information that flowed in and out of his organization. He controlled, above all else, language who spoke, what was said, what was meant, and what was understood. For 20 years, from the moment he had taken over a small import operation in New Jersey at the age of 25 and turned it into something that moved through 3 continents, language had been his most important weapon. He was fluent in English and Italian. He had functional Spanish, and he had never, in 20 years of international business, walked into a room where he could not understand what was happening around him. Until now. The man he was flying to Seoul to negotiate with was Chairman Victor Sterling, 68 years old, chairman of Sterling Pacific Industries, one of the largest private transportation and logistic conglomerates in South Korea. The deal on the table was a distribution partnership worth significant money on both sides. Raphael had done his preparation. He knew the numbers. He knew the history of the company. He knew what Sterling wanted and what Sterling was willing to give up to get it. What he did not know was the language. Not a word of Korean, not even hello. For 20 years, that had not been a problem. Because for 20 years he had Marco. Marco had worked with Raphael since they were both young men. He was 40 years old, fluent in 6 languages, and had the particular gift of making whoever he was translating for exactly as they intended to sound. Not just the words, the weight behind them. Raphael had trusted him the way you trust a part of your own body. 24 hours before departure, Marco had called. Family emergency. He could not travel. Raphael had listened to the explanation, had asked 3 questions, received 3 answers, and then said, quietly, "Fine. Find me someone." His contact in Seoul, a man named Henry, who had worked with Raphael for 12 years, had arranged a replacement within 6 hours. Freelance interpreter. 8 years of experience. Corporate clients, embassy work, clean background check. Name: Claire Morgan. Raphael had read the file on the plane. He had landed in Seoul, walked into the lobby of his hotel, and found her standing there, not sitting, standing with a briefcase in one hand and a half-finished cup of coffee in the other, and he had known immediately, the way he always knew things about people in the first 30 seconds, that she was not going to be easy to manage. He had been right about that. He had also not anticipated that being right about it would matter as little as it did. The first thing Claire Morgan said to Rafael Moro, after they had looked at each other across the marble lobby for 3 full seconds without speaking, was this: "I've read the briefing. I have questions about the protocol for the Sterling Pacific meeting. Not hello. Not it's nice to meet you. Not I've heard a lot about you, or any of the social lubrication that people used to smooth over the fact that they were strangers about to spend a week together in a foreign city. Just, I have questions." Raphael had looked at her for our attention. Then he had said, "You'll have 30 minutes in the car tomorrow morning." "I'll need 45, she had said. A pause. He had almost said no out of reflex, because he was the kind of man who did not renegotiate terms 30 seconds into a working relationship. Then he had said, "Fine." He was still not entirely sure why he had said fine. In the elevator going up to his floor, Raphael had said something to his assistant in Italian, a small observation about the hotel lobby, the quality of the marble, nothing important, private. The kind of thing you say in your own language when you want to be understood only by the person you're speaking to. Claire was standing 2 feet away from him, looking at the elevator doors. She did not react. Not a flicker. Her Italian was, at that point, a secret she had kept for professional reasons for 15 years, and she was very good at keeping it. Raphael noticed nothing. He would not notice for 6 more days. But later, much later, when he thought about that elevator ride, he would understand that the story had really begun there. In 30 seconds of silence, while he said something he thought was private, and she heard every word. The car left the hotel at 7:30 the following morning. Claire was already in it when Raphael arrived at 7:29. He noticed that. She did not acknowledge that he had noticed. For the first 10 minutes of the drive through early morning Seoul, she asked him questions. Not the questions he was used to from interpreters, which were mostly clarifying questions. What does this term mean? What is the correct title for this person? Is this number in millions or billions? Her questions were different. "When you say the timeline is flexible," she said, looking at the briefing document open on her lap, "do you mean you're genuinely open to negotiating as a schedule? Or do you mean you're not moving on the schedule, but you want to sound reasonable?" Raphael looked at her. "What's the difference, from your perspective?" "The difference," she said, "is that in Korean business communication, those two positions require completely different language. If I translate flexible as flexible, and you actually mean fixed, Chairman Sterling will come to the first meeting believing there's room to move on timing. When he finds out there isn't, he will feel misled. Not by you, by me. And then I'm useless to you for the rest of the week." Raphael was quiet for a moment. "It's genuinely flexible. Within 30 days either direction." "Good." She made a note. "Don't use the word urgent in any context. In the formal register Sterling uses, urgent implies desperation. Use tuvli instead. They mean roughly the same thing in English. They don't mean the same thing in Korean." "All right. One more thing. Sterling will have his nephew in the room. The nephew's name is Daniel. He's 28, educated in the United States, and he speaks excellent English. His official function is to handle the formal interpretation. But Sterling occasionally speaks Korean directly to Daniel during meetings, not for the record, not as part of the negotiation, but to say things he does not want you to hear. I'll be positioned to catch those. Do you want me to pass them along to you in real time?" Raphael looked at her again, this time for longer. "Yes," he said. She nodded and went back to her notes. He looked out the window at Seoul, moving past the density of it, the scale, the particular kind of organized chaos that belonged to cities that had rebuilt themselves from nothing in half a century. He understood nothing of what the sign said. He could not read the language, could not speak it, could not even recognize its sounds well enough to guess at meaning. For 20 years, he had never been in a situation like this. In every city he had ever done business in, he had either spoken the language Or had Marco? Marco, who had been with him long enough to be almost invisible. Marco, who knew without being told when to translate literally and when to translate the meaning behind the literal. This woman was not Marco. She was something else entirely, and he was still figuring out what. The Sterling Pacific building occupied the top 15 floors of a tower in Gangnam, and the executive conference room on the 40th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city in three directions. Chairman Victor Sterling was already seated when they were shown in a deliberate choice. Raphael recognized the choice of a man who preferred to receive guests in his own space rather than stand and greet them as equals. Sterling was 68 years old, heavy-set, with the careful stillness of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything through movement or expression. He wore a dark suit. His hands rested flat on the conference table. He looked at Raphael the way you looked at something you were in the process of evaluating. Daniel sat behind at his right shoulder, 28, slim, with an American university education visible in the way he held himself slightly less formal than his uncle, slightly more comfortable with the presence of Westerners. Henry sat beside Raphael, silent, his function today purely logistical. Claire sat to Raphael's left. The meeting began. Daniel handled the official interpretation clean, professional, accurate. Sterling spoke in Korean. Daniel rendered it in English. Raphael responded in English. Daniel rendered it back. The machinery of formal international negotiation, functioning exactly as it was designed to function. And then, 15 minutes in, Sterling leaned slightly toward Daniel and said something in Korean that was not part of the formal exchange. His voice dropped. It was brief, one sentence. Claire, seated 2 feet away, heard every word. She leaned toward Raphael and said, in a voice low enough that only he could hear, "He just told Daniel that you look younger than he expected, and he's not sure you have the authority to close this deal." Raphael did not change his expression. He did not pause. He simply continued what he had been about to say, and in the continuing of it, something shifted not in the content, but in the weight. The way he chose the next 3 sentences. The particular quality of certainty he placed in them. Not louder, not more aggressive. Just present, in a way that could not be dismissed. Claire translated those sentences into Korean. She did not translate them literally. She translated them accurately, which was different. The meaning was identical. The register was adjusted precisely to communicate authority to a 68-year-old Korean businessman of Sterling's specific generation and background, in a way that raw, literal translation would have failed to do. Sterling heard it. The stillness of his hands on it changed very slightly, in a way that probably no one else in the room would have caught. He had revised his initials as he would not make that mistake again. After the meeting, in the elevator going back down to the lobby, Raphael said, "You changed something when I was speaking." "You changed something first," Claire said. "I adjusted the translation to match your intent, not just your words. And if I decide I don't want you making those adjustments." She looked at him steadily. "Then you want a machine, not a person. Machines translate words. I translate meaning. Those are different services." The elevator doors opened. She walked out ahead of him. He stood in the elevator for 1 second after she left, and the closest thing to a smile that Raphael Moro's face generally permitted passed across it and was gone. That evening, he called Elena. He almost didn't. He was tired, the time difference made it awkward, and there was still preparation to do for the following day. But something made him call some habit of obligation that had outlasted whatever use to fuel it. She answered on the third ring. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Fine. Meeting went well. How are you? Good. The fence in the back finally got fixed, and Mrs. Caruso from next door brought over some of that bread you like. That's nice. She asked about you. Tell her hello." A pause. The particular pause of a long marriage, not uncomfortable, but not warm either. The pause of two people who've run out of things to tell each other and are performing the ritual of the phone call anyway. "I waited at Maria last night," Elena said. "For a while." "I know. I'm sorry. The meeting ran long. It's fine." 2 words. And in those 2 words was everything that 18 years had compressed into a habit. It's fine. Don't make it a thing. I've learned not, she said. You too. He ended the call, sat with his phone in his hand for a moment. Then there was a knock at the door. Claire, with tomorrow's briefing documents. He set the phone on the nightstand and stood up. Before he went to sleep, he opened his suitcase to find a document he needed. He found what he was looking for. He also found something else. Something small. Something that wasn't quite where he had put it. A slight displacement in the careful order he always maintained when he traveled, the particular discipline of a man who had learned early that details were the difference between safety and exposure. He stood very still for a moment. Then he pressed his hand flat against the bottom lining of the bag. There was a slight unevenness that should not have been there. He did not investigate further, not tonight. But he lay awake in the soul dark for a long time after he turned off the light, and he did not sleep as well as he usually did. The second day in Seoul began with an unusual lesson. Raphael had come down to the hotel lobby at 7:15 to find Claire already there, as expected. What he had not expected was the single Korean word she taught him before they got into the car. She wrote it out phonetically on a small piece of paper. Guanchanayo. It means something close to "we're okay here," she said. Or "don't worry, we're steady." There's no exact English translation. Koreans use it when they want someone in a difficult moment to feel less alone. If something goes wrong in the room today, any kind of awkward pause, any small mistake, if you say this word naturally, not performed, not rehearsed sounding, it changes the temperature of the space. Raphael looked at the paper. Why this word specifically? Because it's generous, she said. Most people in a high-pressure negotiation are trying to project confidence or authority. This word projects something different. It says, I'm not rattled, and neither should you be. That's much harder to argue with than confidence. He repeated the word. His pronunciation was not good. She corrected him. Twice. A third time. There was no impatience in it. Just the plain persistence of a person who understood that getting something right was worth the repetition. On the fourth attempt, he got closer. She nodded once. My father died in a hospital in Newark, Raphael said. He did not know why he said it. The word had opened something. The way certain specific words sometimes do not their meaning but their texture. The particular emotional frequency they carried. He was not a man who spoke about his father. He was not a man who spoke about anything personal, as a rule. But he said it, no interpreter. He kept asking for water, and the nurses recorded in his chart that he was asking for pain medication. He died in a room where no one understood what he was saying. I was 12 years old, and I sat in the hallway for 6 hours, and I didn't know what was happening because no one told me, and I couldn't ask because no one spoke Italian. Claire was quiet. She did not say I'm sorry. She did not fill the silence with anything. She received what he had said, the way you receive something fragile carefully, without commentary. That's why, she said, after a moment that was long enough to be real and short enough not to be theatrical. That's why this word. He looked at her. She had understood something about him that he had not explained. He had given her one piece, his father, the hospital, and she had understood the whole shape of it, why he controlled every room he walked into, why he had never, in 20 years, allowed himself to be in a situation where he could not understand what was being said around him. Until now. What does that notebook say about me? He asked. He had seen her writing in it the previous evening, after the meeting. She considered whether to answer. Then she opened the notebook and read, speaks Italian when he actually means something. Speaks English when he's working. Pauses before the most important thing. Trusts slowly. Once given, completely. He looked at the notebook. The writing was a mixture of shorthand, phonetic symbols, and what appeared to be a personal notation system she had developed over years of working. He could not read a word of it. The last part, he said, trusts completely.
You added that recently.
Last night, she said, after you agreed to let me handle the real-time relay. He said nothing. The car pulled up outside the building, and they got out. The second meeting went better than the first. Not because the negotiation itself moved forward significantly, it did not, but because Raphael was beginning to understand the rhythm of the room. The way Sterling structured his sentences. The specific pauses that meant he was considering. The different pauses that meant he had already decided, but was maintaining the performance of consideration. Claire had explained this on the ride over. Sterling comes from a generation that views the negotiation table as a kind of theater. Both sides are performing. The performance has rules. Breaking the rules, even to move faster, even to be more direct, reads as disrespect. You have to stay in the performance even when you can see through it. So we perform, Raphael had said. We perform excellently, she had said. There's a difference. In the meeting, Daniel translated the formal exchanges. Claire sat beside Raphael and translated everything else, the asides to Daniel, the comments Sterling made to his other associates, the small inflections that changed meaning without changing words. She did it in a murmur so low that Raphael had to lean slightly toward her to catch it, which put them close enough together that Daniel, across the table, glanced at them once with something that might have been curiosity and might have been concern. After the meeting, in the lobby, Henry pulled Raphael aside. His face carried the careful, neutral expression of a man delivering information he wasn't sure how to frame. Sterling has been asking questions, Henry said. Not about the contract. About your last 3 import shipments, the manifests specifically. Raphael processed this. He's looking for something. Henry did not confirm or deny. The fact that he didn't deny it was confirmation enough. Find out what you can, Raphael said, quietly. Henry nodded and left. That evening, over dinner, a small restaurant Claire had chosen, real food in a neighborhood that catered to locals, rather than tourists, she told him about Nunchi. It's a Korean concept without a direct English translation, she said. The closest is reading the room. But that makes it sound passive. Nunchi is active. It's the ability to sense what isn't being said, to feel the emotional temperature of a space and adjust to it in real time. In Korean culture, someone with good nunchi is considered one of the most socially intelligent people you can know. And Sterling will be testing whether I have it tomorrow. He'll be testing it every day. But tomorrow especially, because tomorrow is when he starts making real decisions about whether he wants to do this deal or not. Raphael ate the food she had ordered for him without asking what it was. It was good, spicy in a way that built slowly, rather than hitting all at once. You think I have it, he said. It was not quite a question. You've been reading me since the moment we met, she said. You've been adjusting based on what you read. You just don't have the word for it. He looked at her. What do I read from you? That's not part of the service, she said. He almost smiled. What's the separate charge? Telling you that would also cost extra. He ate. She ate. The restaurant was small and warm, and outside the window, Sol moved past in its dense, indecipherable way. His phone buzzed on the table. Elena. He looked at the screen, then he set the phone face down and continued eating. Claire saw him do it. She said nothing. At the end of the meal, the server said something to Claire in Korean. Claire responded. They exchanged 2 more short lines, something with a joke in it. From the way the server's expression shifted, and Claire laughed. A real laugh, brief, completely natural, the laugh of a person in their element. Raphael watched the exchange, and he recognized something in it that he had not seen before this moment. There was a version of the woman sitting across from him that only existed in Korean. A lightness, an ease, something that wasn't visible when she was working. What was that about? He asked. She asked if the food was good. I said yes. She said, Americans always look surprised that spicy food can be this good. I told her you were Italian, not American. She said that explained the expression. What expression? Claire looked at him with something that stopped just short of being a smile. The expression of someone who has already decided they like something but is still pretending to evaluate. He said nothing. She picked up her tea. That night, in his hotel room, Raphael went back to the suitcase. He was more systematic this time. He removed everything. He pressed his hands along every surface, every lining, every panel. He found it along the bottom, a thin envelope, sealed to the underside of the base, flush against the fabric, Invisible, unless you were specifically looking for something that shouldn't be there. He sat down on the edge of the bed and held the envelope in his hands for a moment without opening it. Then he opened it. Documents. Several pages, tightly packed. Not English, not Italian, not Korean. He stared at the pages for a long moment. He could identify nothing. Not the language, not the meaning, not the origin. He picked up his phone. He scrolled to Claire's number. He hesitated. She was his interpreter, not his confidant. She had been working for him for 2 days. He did not know her. He did not know who she was, or what zoned, or what she'd do with information like this. He called her anyway. She answered on the second ring. "There's something you need to look at," he said. "Can you come to my room?" A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. "Give me 10 minutes. She was there in 12. She read the documents without speaking. Raphael stood by the window while she sat at the small desk and worked through the pages one by one. She read Korean fluently and Japanese almost as fluently, which she had not mentioned, which he noted. Her face while she read was the same face she wore in the negotiating room present, processing, giving nothing away. It took 4 minutes. When she set the last page down, she was quiet for a moment. "This is Japanese," she said. "I assumed. What does it say?" "It's a record of a financial transaction. A significant one. Between a major Korean corporate entity and a government official. The dates are from 1998. She paused. "It documents a bribery arrangement. A construction contract, a large one, infrastructure level. If this is authentic, it's enough to end the career of the person named in it. More than that, actually. It's enough for criminal prosecution." "Whose name is on it?" she told him. He sat down. Victor Sterling. The man he had been sitting across a conference table from for 2 days. The man whose manifest inquiries Henry had flagged that afternoon. The man whose deal he had flown to Seoul to close. "It was in my suitcase," Raphael said. "Yes. Which means either someone planted it to make me look like I came here to blackmail him, or someone's used me as a courier without my knowledge. Or," he said, "both." "Or both," she agreed. The hotel room was very quiet. 22 floors below, Seoul continued doing whatever Seoul did at midnight. "Marco," Raphael said. It was not a question, but she treated it like one. "Your previous interpreter. He packed this bag. He's the only person outside of my immediate staff who handled it in the 24 hours before I got on the plane." He paused. "And he's the only person I know of who had a reason to access it without drawing attention." "What reason?" "That's what I don't know yet." Claire looked at him. She was doing the thing she did reading him, the specific attention of someone who had spent 15 years in rooms where the visible and the actual were rarely the same thing. "What are you going to do with these documents?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "What I always do with things I didn't ask for but now have to deal with. Find out who they belong to, and return them in a way that makes absolutely clear that they were never mine to have." She kept looking at him. He could see her deciding something. "I need to know what you actually do," she said. "Not the import business. What you actually do. Because what I say tomorrow depends on it." It was the first time she had used his first name without the formal prefix. He noticed it. "I move things," he said. "Expensive things. Across borders. Not always by the most straightforward route." "Are you the kind of person who would use those documents to harm someone?" "No." "Are you the kind of person who would let someone else use them?" "No." She looked at him for a long time after that. The hotel room was quiet. Outside the window, the city was a field of light that neither of them was looking at. Then she nodded. "Once. The decisive kind." "Then tomorrow we go to the meeting," she said. "And you let me handle the language."
She gathered the documents.
Placed carefully back in the envelope and set it on the desk. "I'll need you to get these out of this building tonight," she said. "Not destroyed, that could matter later, but somewhere that isn't your room or your person. Henry. Is Henry trustworthy?" He thought about that, for precisely as long as the question deserved. "For this, yes." "Then, Henry." She stood up. 7:30 tomorrow. She left. Raphael sat in the hotel room for a long time after the door closed. He called Henry, arranged the transfer of the envelope, and then sat back down and looked at the city outside the window. Somewhere across that city, Victor Sterling knew something, and someone, Marco, or someone who had used Marco had put Raphael directly in the middle of it. The question was why. In New York, it was mid-afternoon. Elena was in the kitchen, the windows open, the sounds of the city coming in from the street. She had made tea she wasn't drinking, and was sitting at the counter looking at nothing in particular. She had not spoken to Raphael in 36 hours. The last call had been brief and routine. She had mentioned the restaurant. He had apologized. She had said it was fine. It was fine. That was the thing. It was always fine, and fine was a word she had once used to mean something, and now used to mean something else entirely. And the distance between those two meanings had grown so gradually that she could not remember when the shift had happened. She picked up her phone and called him. It rang 4 times and went into voicemail. She did not leave a message. There was nothing specific she needed to say. She had called because she had wanted to hear his voice, and since she was not going to get that, there was nothing worth recording. She put the phone down and drank her cold tea and did not let herself think about what she was not thinking about. The morning of the third meeting, Raphael said something in the car that he had not planned to say. If you hear anything in that room today that changes my situation, anything about those documents, anything about what Sterling knows, anything that means I'm walking into something I can't see, tell me immediately. Don't filter it. Don't decide for me what I need to know. Claire considered this. You're asking me to take your side. I'm asking you to tell me the truth in real time, a different time. That's a different thing. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, he nodded. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, the silence of two people who had arrived at an understanding and did not need to discuss it further. The third meeting was different from the first two. It was different because Victor Sterling had decided something. Raphael could feel at the moment they were shown into the conference room, the changed quality of the air in the room, the way Sterling's two associates were positioned slightly differently, the way Daniel held himself with a tension that had not been there before. Something had shifted. The question was in which direction. The meeting began formally. Terms, logistics, timeline. Daniel translated, Claire relayed. 20 minutes in, Sterling spoke to Daniel in an aside that was quiet enough to be private but not quiet enough, given where Claire was sitting. She leaned toward Raphael. He's asking Daniel whether you brought anything unusual in your luggage when you arrived in Seoul. Daniel says he doesn't know, so Sterling already knows about the documents. Raphael kept his expression and his voice exactly where they were. He finished his current sentences about the shipping schedule and then said, smoothly, as though continuing the same thought, before we go further, I'd like to address something directly. Daniel translated. Sterling looked up. Claire translated Raphael's next words in real time. And at the end of one particular sentence, when Raphael said that he preferred to conduct business on a foundation of mutual clarity, she added 3 words in Korean that Raphael had not said, words that in Korean business culture carried a specific implicit meaning. Let's speak plainly here. We are both adults who understand that there is something in this room that has not been named. Sterling heard those 3 words. He went very still. He looked at Raphael with a different quality of attention than he had used before. The evaluative look was gone. What replaced it was something more direct, something that approached honesty. Sterling spoke. A long sentence. Daniel translated it, but carefully, choosing words with the deliberation of a person who was trying to stay neutral in something that was no longer neutral. He says, Daniel said, that he believes there has been a misunderstanding about the purpose of this meeting. He says he would like to speak more candidly, if that is acceptable. Tell him yes, Raphael said immediately. Claire translated. Sterling took a breath. He spoke for almost a full minute. Daniel listened and then translated in pieces. That Sterling had received information from a third party he would not name. That the American partner coming to Seoul was carrying documents intended to be used as leverage against Sterling personally. That Sterling had believed, until this meeting, that this threat was real and intentional, that he was now less certain, that he wanted to understand who had sent those documents and why. Raphael listened to all of it. Then he spoke slowly enough that Claire could catch every word. I found something in my luggage that I did not put there. I don't know who did. Whatever it was, it is no longer in my possession, and I have no interest in using it or delivering it for anyone. I came to Seoul to negotiate a contract. That is still what I want to do. Whether we continue depends on whether you believe me. Claire translated it exactly as he had said it, word for word. Nothing added, nothing softened. Sterling was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not much small exhale of genuine amusement, the laugh of a man who had braced for something much worse and was recalibrating in real time. He spoke a short sentence. Daniel looked down at the table. Claire translated. He says he has been in business for 40 years. He says he can count on one hand the number of times an American businessman has told him the unvarnished truth without being cornered into it. He says he would like to continue the negotiation. The meeting ran another 90 minutes and ended with a framework agreement to move forward. In the car afterward, Raphael asked about the 3 words. What you added in Korean. What were they? Roughly, let us speak honestly here, she said. You were both circling it. Someone needed to stop circling. You changed what I said. I translated what you were trying to do, which is different from translating what you said. He looked at her. Don't do it again without telling me first. Fair. What I said to Sterling in that room, he said, was true. I want you to know that. She looked back at him. I know. That's why I added the 3 words. I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't believed you. That evening, something else happened. Daniel found Claire in the hotel lobby, alone, after Raphael had gone upstairs. He was careful about it, looking over his shoulder before he approached, speaking quietly. His English was good, American accented, Boston University, still audible in it. I want to tell you something, he said. Off the record. Person to person. Claire waited. My uncle is not a bad man, Daniel said. He made a bad decision 20 years ago, during a very bad time for this country economically. The official he paid the one in those documents he died 4 years ago. There is no open case. There is no public interest that would be served by any of this coming out now. He paused. The only people who benefit from that information existing are people who want to use it as a weapon. And the people I've seen trying to use it are not the people who should be anywhere near it. Why are you telling me this? Claire asked. Because I think Mr. Morrow is being aimed, Daniel said. And I think you know that. And I think you're the only person in this building right now who cares about the actual truth more than about winning. She looked at the young man across from her, 28 years old, visibly uncomfortable in the role he was being asked to play, choosing to step outside it because his conscience had reached its limit. I'll pass this along, she said. That's all I'm asking, he said. He left. Claire stood in the lobby for a moment. Then she went upstairs and knocked on Raphael's door and told him everything Daniel had said, word for word, the way she always relayed information accurately, without interpretation, letting him do his own reading. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. He's right, Raphael said. We're not the origin of this. Someone put us in the same room on purpose. Yes. The question is who? The question, she said, is who benefits when you and Sterling become enemies. It was late. 11 o'clock. Raphael should have been reviewing documents or sleeping. Instead, he was sitting at the small bar on the 42nd floor of the hotel, alone, with a glass of something he wasn't drinking, looking at Seoul spread out below like a circuit board that someone had left running. He heard her before he saw her. Not her footsteps, the particular quality of the silence that changed when she walked into a room. He had noticed that about her. She was quiet in a way that was different from absence. She stopped at the entrance to the bar, looked at him. He looked back. She could have kept walking. She did not. She came and sat down across from him. The server appeared. She ordered tea. They sat for a moment without speaking, and the silence was the easiest silence he had been in all week. He started talking about Naples. He did not plan to. It came out the way things come out when it is late and you are far from home, and the defenses are down in the small specific way that exhaustion creates. He talked about the neighborhood where his parents had lived when he was very young, before his father brought the family to New Jersey. The light there, the way the sea looked in early morning, the particular smell of bread from a bakery that had been on the same corner since before his grandfather was born. Claire listened. She did not perform listenings, she just listened. And then Raphael, as he sometimes did when he was tired, and speaking about something that mattered, said a sentence in Italian. He said it to the air, to himself, to the version of his father he still carried somewhere in the back of his chest. He said, he would have known exactly what to do here. He always knew what to do in a room where he was the outsider. I never figured out how he did it, Claire answered him. In Italian, flawless, not textbook Italian living Italian, roses inside a family and a house and a daily life rather than out of grammar exercises. Central Italian register, warm consonants, the rhythm of someone who had dreamed in this language for years. Raphael stopped. He put down his glass. You speak Italian, he said. In Italian. Yes, she said. In Italian. Since when? Since I was 9. My stepfather was American and Pelican. I grew up with it inside a family. I spoke it every day for 12 years. Raphael was very still. He was calculating not consciously, just the automatic assessment that happened when new information arrived, and the shape of what he thought he knew had to be revised. You've heard everything I've said in Italian this week, he said. Yes, everything I said to Daniel in the elevator on the first day. Everything I've said on the phone to my office. Everything I said to myself when I thought I was alone. Yes, and you didn't tell me. No, he looked at her, not angry, something more complicated than anger. Why not? She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Sol kept doing what Sol did. Because when people know Ike their language, she said, they stop being unguarded. They start managing what they say in front of me, the same way they manage what they say in the meeting. And the things they say when they're unguarded, those are the things I need to know in order to do my job well. She paused. In 4 days, the things you said in Italian, without knowing I understood about the documents, about Marco, about whether to trust Henry, about your father, those things helped me do what I did in that meeting today. You used what I didn't know you were hearing. Yes, that's a violation, I know, and I'm telling you now. Why now? She looked at her tea. Because today, you did something in that meeting that I have never seen anyone do in a high-pressure negotiation. You told the truth when the calculated move was to stay ambiguous. And I realized I was doing the opposite. She paused. So I'm telling you the truth, even though I know it changes how you think about this week. He was quiet for a long time. The city below them was very bright, very far away. What did I say about my father? He asked. In Italian. All of it. She looked at him steadily. You said he would have known what to do in a room where he was the outsider. He always knew. I never figured out how he did it. She paused. You said it twice. Once on the first night, once in the car on the way to the second meeting. He looked down at the table, at his left hand flat against the surface. He figured it out the same way you're figuring it out now, Claire said. By paying close attention to the person in the room who understood what everyone else was saying. Raphael said nothing. After a moment, your stepfather, how long? 12 years. Good years. He died when I was 21. My mother stayed in Chicago. I drove home for another 3 years because I didn't know how to be who I had been before. But you came back eventually. You always come back to the first language. What's the first language? The one you dream in. Yours? English. But Italian is where I keep certain things. He looked at her. Mine is Italian. But I live in English. I know, she said. I can hear it. Italian is where you keep what matters to you. English is where you conduct business. He was quiet for a moment. What does the notebook say about me now? After tonight. She opened it. Read. Speaks Italian when he actually means something. Speaks English when he's working. Pauses before the most important thing. Trusts slowly. Once given. Completely. She closed the notebook. I added that last part 2 nights ago. I added something else just now. What? I'll tell you when I decide whether to. He looked at her. This was a sentence that gave him nothing to hold on to, no angle of approach, no way to extract the information he wanted. He was the kind of man who, in most situations, could find the angle. He could not find it here. That did not frustrate him. It surprised him that it didn't. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not his wallet, not his phone, and placed a small piece of paper on the table in front of her. It was old. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The writing was in faded Italian ink. A name. A date. My father's name, he said. The day he died. I've carried this since I was 12 years old. I don't know why I never threw it away. She looked at the paper for a long time. Then she said, in Italian, with the exact pronunciation of someone who had grown up hearing the name spoken correctly. Antonino, yes. It's a beautiful name. He was a good man. The silence after that was the best silence of the week. That night, in New York, Elena could not sleep. She lay in the bed that was too large for one person and looked at the ceiling and tried to locate the source of the specific discomfort she was feeling. It was not worry, exactly. She was not a worrier by nature. It was something quieter, more like the awareness of a gap, a space where something used to be that was no longer there, and the outline of the space was becoming more visible the more she tried not to look at it. She thought about the restaurant, the empty chair, the way she had told the server it was just her tonight, with a smile that had not cost her anything. She had learned not to let things cost her anything. She was not sure, lying there in the dark, whether that was strength or something else. Henry came to Raphael's room early the following morning. His face had the quality of someone who had been up for most of the night and had not arrived at good news. He sat down. He did not accept coffee. Sterling made contact, Henry said. Not through official channels. Directly, to me. He wants a meeting, private. You, him, Daniel. No one else. No interpreter. He specifically said no interpreter. Raphael looked at the ceiling for a moment. He wants Claire removed from the equation. Yes. Why? Henry was careful with his next words. Sterling told Daniel that the interpreter presents a problem. She heard things this week that she should not have heard. He's concerned about where that information goes. She heard things I needed her to hear, Raphael said. That was the entire purpose of having her in the room. I understand. But Sterling doesn't see it that way. Raphael stood up and went to the window. Seoul below, morning light, the city already in full motion. Is he going to do something? He asked. In a business context, no. Sterling is a businessman. He doesn't create problems that can be traced back to him, outside a business context. Henry was quiet for a moment too long. I need her moved to a different hotel, Raphael said. Henry nodded. Today, before this evening, he found Claire in the hotel restaurant at breakfast, going through her notes with the focused efficiency that seemed to be her default state. He sat down across from her and said without preamble, Sterling wants you removed from the process. He's concerned about what you know. She looked up from her notes. How serious is it? Serious enough that I'm moving you to a different hotel today. That feels like an overreaction. Claire. He stopped. She looked at him. Victor Sterling has been running a business with very specific vulnerabilities for 20 years. Those documents, the ones that were in my bag, represent something that could genuinely destroy what he has spent his life building. He doesn't know you. He doesn't know what you'll do with what you've heard. That makes you a variable he wants to eliminate. You're worried about me, she said. I'm managing a risk. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He looked at her. There was a brief silence. Different hotel, she said. Fine, but I'm in the room for whatever comes next. Obviously, she's back to her notes. He drank his coffee. Outside the restaurant windows, Seoul was bright and cold and indecipherable. That afternoon, Daniel sent a message through a channel he was clearly not supposed to be using. It said, I need to speak with Claire Morgan. Privately. It's important. Raphael showed the message to Henry, who showed it to Claire. She agreed to meet him. The meeting was brief. Daniel was visibly uncomfortable, a 28-year-old man, being asked to carry too much by people older than him, and finding the weight finally more than he wanted to hold.
My uncle is being used.
Daniel said. The same way your employer is being used. Someone took something from 20 years ago and turned it into a weapon, and they aimed it at both of them. My uncle thinks Moro is the threat. Moro thinks my uncle is the threat. Neither of them is actually the threat. Who is? Claire asked. I don't know the specific name. But I know that the information about the documents, the warning my uncle received, the timing of all of it, it came through a logistics broker in Hong Kong, a European company. And the only people who benefit from my uncle and your employer not doing this deal are the people who want to move into this market themselves. He handed her a name, a company name, European, logistics. This is off the record, he said. I know, Claire said. If my uncle finds out, I told you this, he won't, she said. Not from me. Daniel nodded. He looked as he left like a person who had just put down something heavy and was not yet sure he had put it in the right place. Claire called Raphael and told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. A European logistics company, he said. Trying to move into the Korean market, she said. If you and Sterling kill each other over those documents, the market opens up. It's not personal. It never was. It never is, he said. That's the thing about it. It's always just business. He paused. I need to call someone in New York. I'll be here, she said. He called. The call took 20 minutes. When it was done, he had a name, a parent company, 3 subsidiary entities, and a clear picture of exactly who had decided that Raphael Moro and Victor Sterling in the same room was a problem that needed to be manufactured into a crisis. He called Claire back. Dutch, he said. Logistics conglomerate. Publicly traded. 18 months from their first major Korean market entry. If this deal happens, they lose first mover advantage. So someone in their organization, probably not even senior, probably a mid-level strategy person, decided to find the pressure points and apply them. That's it, Claire said. That's usually it. The answer is almost always boring. Big problems usually are, she said. He almost laughed. That evening, Raphael called Marco. Not through any of his regular lines. A private number that Marco had given him years ago for emergencies, a number that went to a phone kept in a drawer in Marco's apartment and used for nothing else. Marco answered on the 4th ring. His voice had the particular quality of a man who had been waiting for this call and dreading it in equal measure. Tell me, Raphael said. There was a long pause, then Marco told him. 8 years of genuine loyalty. 12 years of friendship, if they were being accurate about it. And then, 10 years ago, before Marco had ever worked for Raphael, something that Marco had done a financial arrangement that had seemed manageable at the time and had not been, and the paper trail from it had survived longer than it should have. Someone found it, not recently, 18 months ago, the same 18-month window during which a Dutch logistics company had been planning its Korean market entry. They didn't ask for money, Mark said. They asked for one thing. They said, put a package in Moro's bag. The Seoul trip. Say nothing. The package would be retrieved on the other end, and that would be the end of it. You didn't know what was in it, Raphael said. I didn't know what was in it. Raphael believed him. Not because believing him changed anything, but because he had known Marco for 12 years, and he could hear the difference between performed innocence and actual ignorance. They told you someone would retrieve it in Seoul, Raphael said. Who? I don't know. I never got a name. All I got was the contact number, the instructions, and a deadline. Describe the person who contacted you, everything you remember. Marco described a phone call. A voicemail, he was almost certain. Spoke Italian with a northern Italian accent, Lombardy or thereabouts. But something was off about it. Something in the rhythm that was not quite right. Not native Italian? Raphael asked. Not quite, like someone who learned it very well but learned it as an adult, not as a child. Raphael looked at Claire across the room where she was listening. She was very still. When he ended the call, he said, What did you hear? Northern Italian, adult acquisition, something off in the rhythm, she said. That's a learner whose first language shaped how they picked up Italian. And if you learned adult Italian but your rhythm is off in that specific way, she thought for a moment. German substrate, or Dutch, sometimes Flemish. Dutch, Raphael said. Probably, she said. Someone at that company learned Italian well enough to make contact, not well enough to remove every trace of where they started. He nodded. We need to give Sterling what we have, he said. Yes, tonight. I'll arrange it through Daniel. The meeting that evening was not like any of the official meetings that had preceded it. There was no conference room, no formal seating arrangement. Just Raphael and Victor Sterling across a table in a private room in a restaurant near Sterling's office, with Daniel and Claire present and no one else. No theater, no performance. Sterling arrived looking like a man who had also spent the last several days holding something heavy. He sat down. He looked at Raphael. Raphael spoke first, directly, in English, knowing Claire would translate into Korean as precisely as she as always did. I didn't come here with those documents. I didn't know they were in my bag. I found them on the second night and immediately secured them. The person who put them there was coerced by a third party, a European logistics company, that wanted this deal to fail. You received false information from the same source. Sterling listened. He looked at Daniel when Raphael finished, and something passed between them, a generational communication that needed no translation. Then Sterling spoke. Claire translated. He says received the warning from a Hong Kong broker he has used before. He checked the broker's background this morning after Daniel told him what Daniel knew. The broker received a significant payment from a European entity 18 months ago. He was paid to pass along the warning. The same people, Raphael said. Claire translated. Sterling nodded. Sterling spoke again. Claire translated. He says in 40 years of business, he has spent most of it believing that the Americans and the Koreans were natural competitors. He says he may have been wrong about which direction the competition was coming from. Tell him that the most dangerous competition is always the one that hides itself inside someone else's conflict, Raphael said. Claire translated. Sterling heard it. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition, one businessman to another. Sterling spoke. Daniel actually smiled this time. Claire translated. He says he would prefer to have you as a partner. He says the contract is on the table whenever you're ready to sign. Tell him, Raphael said, that I'd like to sign it tomorrow. After Sterling and Daniel had left, Raphael sat alone in the room for a moment. He had done what needed to be done. The situation was resolved. The deal would close. The Dutch company would find that their strategy had failed and would spend the next several months dealing with the consequences of manufactured a crisis that could be traced back to them. The practical matters were settled. He picked up his phone and looked at it for a moment without doing anything with it. Then he called Elena. She answered on the second ring. Hey, she said, the cautious surprise of a woman who had expected voicemail. Hi, sorry it's late. It's fine. Is everything okay? Everything's fine. He paused. In another room, somewhere in Seoul, Claire Morgan was getting ready to go back to her hotel and he would not see her again until morning. In New York, his wife was sitting up in the large quiet house, holding a phone and waiting to find out what this call was for. I wanted to hear your voice, he said. A silence on the line. 3 seconds. 4. Yeah, Elena said, and her voice changed. Not dramatically, just very slightly more real. When are you coming home? Day after tomorrow. I'll be there. I know. He paused. I want to take you to Maria when I get back. Properly. A table for 2. I won't be late. Another pause. Longer this time. Okay, she said. One word. But the way she said it was different from the way she had said it's fine at the restaurant 2 weeks ago. The difference was small and enormous at the same time. Sleep well, he said. You too, she said. The contract was signed the following afternoon. Daniel handled the technical language at the end, the boilerplate that required accuracy more than nuance. Claire sat to one side and did not participate, reviewing something on her phone, present but not needed for this part. Sterling shook Raphael's hand when it was done. A proper handshake, the kind that meant something. As Sterling was leaving, he walked past Claire. He stopped, said something to her quietly in Korean. Daniel was across the room and did not hear it. After Sterling had gone, Raphael looked at Claire. What did he say?
She was quiet for a moment.
He said you're better at this than just translating. He said I should know that. What did you say? I told him I know. Raphael looked at her. Do you? I'm starting to, she said. That evening, Claire was packing her work materials in the small business center off the hotel lobby when Raphael found her. She looked up when he came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then came and sat down across from her. "I've worked with a lot of interpreters," he said, "in 20 years. Good ones. People who were technically excellent and completely professional. But," she said, "none of them ever told me what the words meant, the real meaning, the weight behind them. What the other person was actually trying to say, and what I was actually trying to say, and whether those two things were moving toward each other or away. That's the job," she said. "It's not what most people understand the job to be." She looked at him. "What do you want to say, Raphael?" He was quiet for a moment. This was the pause she had noted in her notebook on the first day, the pause that happened before the most important thing. She recognized it. "You listened to me speak Italian for a week," he said. "Without telling me you understood. You heard things I said about my father, about my business, about the parts of my life I don't discuss with anyone. You heard them and you used them not against me, but to help me. And you did it without my knowledge." He paused. "That should bother me more than it does. Why doesn't it?" "Because everything you heard, you kept. You didn't use it to gain advantage over me. You used it to do your job better." He paused. "And because I think you heard things that I've stopped saying out loud to anyone. And it turns out I needed someone to hear them." She was quiet. He reached into his chest pocket and placed the small old piece of paper on the table between them. The paper with his father's name. The paper he had carried since he was 12 years old. "I've never shown this to anyone," he said. "I showed it to you the other night. I want you to know that was not a small thing." She looked at the paper, then at him. "I know," she said. She opened the notebook. She turned to his page, the page she had been adding to all week, and she wrote one more line. Then she tore the page out and placed it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He could not read a word. "What does it say?" he asked. "Everything I wrote about you this week. How you speak, what you mean when you use Italian instead of English. The pause before the important thing. The left hand when you're deciding whether to trust." She touched the last line with one finger. "And what I wrote just now." "Which is?" "The word sanjibioset," she said. She pronounced it slowly. "It's Korean. A type of wild mushroom. Extremely rare. It grows only under very specific conditions, altitude, soil, temperature, all of them have to be exactly right. Most people who find it weren't looking for it. They were looking for something else." He looked at the paper, at the writing he could not read. "You wrote a mushroom," he said. "I wrote a metaphor," she said. She closed the notebook. She stood up and gathered her materials. "Milan," she said. 2 months, if you still want someone who's good with words. "I'll send the dates," he said. She picked up her bag and walked out. He sat at the table for a long time after she left, holding the piece of paper with the writing he couldn't read. Then he placed it in his chest pocket. Next to the paper with his father's name on it, 2 pieces of paper, both illegible to anyone but the person who wrote them. Both telling the same story, from opposite ends of the same life. The plane back to New York left Seoul at 11 in the morning. Raphael sat alone in the rear section of the cabin, the way he always did, with the small reading light on and the window shaded up. 30,000 feet below, the Pacific was dark and indistinct. In 14 hours, he would be in New York. He was holding the piece of paper Claire had given him. He had been looking at it on and off since the car ride to the airport. The handwriting was neat and small and mixed English characters and Korean, and the private shorthand she had developed over years of work. He could read his name at the top of the page because she had written it in block English letters. He could read the date, same reason. The rest was completely opaque to him. He thought about that. About what it meant to carry a piece of writing you couldn't read. About his father's paper, which he had been carrying for 33 years, a paper he could read but had never needed to, because the information on it was already in him. The name, the date, he knew them without looking. He kept the paper anyway. He put Claire's page in the same pocket. He picked up his phone and scrolled to Alesina's number. It was late afternoon in New York. She would be home. He thought about what he was going to say and found that he did not know exactly, which was unusual for him. He was a man who generally knew what he was going to say before he said it. He called. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been somewhere near her phone. Hey, she said. Hey, I'm on the plane. How long? 14 hours, give or take. I'll be home tomorrow morning. Okay, I'll be there. He paused. Outside the small window, the Pacific was dark. Next to him, in his chest pocket, 2 pieces of paper, one from when he was 12, one from last night. I meant what I said the other night, he said. Maria, the two of us. Real dinner, not a thing I'm late to. A pause on her end, he could hear her thinking. Why? She asked, not accusatory, genuinely asking. The question of someone who had learned to ask why before she let herself want something. He thought about how to answer that. He thought about a week in a city where he couldn't understand the language. About a woman who had heard the parts he had stopped saying out loud and hadn't flinched. About what it had shown him, the way you see a thing clearly in a mirror, that you can't see clearly when you look directly at it. Because I've been a long way from home this week, he said. And I had a lot of time to think about what home is supposed to mean. And I think I've been doing it wrong for a while. Elena was quiet. The quality of the silence was different from the silences they've been sitting in lately. More real, more careful, in the way that things are careful when they matter. That's a big thing to say on the phone, she said. I know. I'll say it better when I'm there. Okay, she said. And then, Raphael, yeah, I've been doing it wrong too. I want you to know that. It's not only on you. He closed his eyes for a moment. 14 hours, she said. 14 hours. I'll have coffee ready. He smiled the first real smile without anything held back that he had managed all week. Yeah, okay. Get some sleep, she said. I will. He hung up. He leaned his head back against the seat. Outside the Pacific, just still dark and vast and silent, the way things are when you're high enough above them to see the whole shape. He thought about his father, about a 12-year-old boy in a hospital hallway in Newark who had not known what was happening because no one spoke the right language. About how that boy had spent 33 years building walls made of language, controlling every room, controlling every conversation, making sure he always understood everything being said, and nothing could surprise him. And then he had gone to Seoul and handed all of that over to a woman he had never met, because there was no other choice. And she had taken it carefully, used it well, heard the things he hadn't said out loud, and given them back to him in a form he could actually use. And what had she shown him in the end? She had shown him Elena at a table with an empty chair across from it. She had shown him 18 years of it's fine and don't wait, and I'll be there. She had shown him a woman who had learned to eat alone in a restaurant she loved, because that was easier than making it a problem. She had shown him that the walls he had built out of language had kept him in as surely as they had kept anything else out. He placed his hand flat on his chest, over the pocket where the 2 pieces of paper were. Antonino Moro. The date. The name of the man who had known how to be an outsider in a room, and had not been able to pass that knowledge on before he ran out of time. And the other page. Sanjibio set. A rare thing that grew only under very specific conditions, and was found by people who were looking for something else. Raphael closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he slept well on a long flight. In Rome, the following morning, Claire sat in a coffee bar near the Pantheon with a cappuccino, and her notebook open to a new page. New job. New person. She had the briefing materials in her bag, and a meeting in 3 days, and all the machinery of her working life ready to resume. She looked at the blank page for a moment. Then, before she wrote the new client's name at the top, she turned back one page, the torn edge still visible, where she had removed the previous page, and she read what remained of her notes. Pauses before the most important thing. She thought for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote on the new page, before anything else, before the new name and the new job and the new week. Asked for the word he didn't have. That's new. She looked at those words for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and drank her coffee and looked out at the square, where the morning light was doing always did, Italian morning light old stone, landing in a way that made everything look like. It had always been exactly this way, and always would be. She was not a person who planned far ahead, but she found herself thinking, with a specific quality of curiosity that she recognized as different from her usual professional interest, about Milan in 2 months. In Seoul, Daniel poured tea for his uncle at the family dinner table. It was a quiet evening, no business talk. The kind of evening that, a week ago, had seemed less certain than it should have. Victor Sterling accepted the tea without speaking. He drank it. He looked out at the garden his wife had planted 20 years ago and tended since. The American, Sterling said after a while. He was straightforward. Yes, Daniel said. I didn't expect that. No. Sterling drank his tea. The garden was dark outside. The lights of the house made yellow rectangles on the grass. The interpreter, Sterling said. She was exceptional. She was. You should keep her number, Sterling said. Daniel smiled. I already did. In New York, at Maria's restaurant on the Upper West Side, a table was set for two by the window. The candles were lit. The wine was poured. The server, not the young one who hadn't learned to read a room, but the older one who had been there for years, set two menus and moved away without saying anything unnecessary. Elena was there first. She always was. But tonight, she was not watching the door with the braced patience of a woman who has learned to wait, without showing that she is waiting. She was watching it with something different, something more like genuine expectation. The door opened. Raphael walked in. He was on time. He crossed the room to the table, and he did not sit down immediately. He stood for a moment and looked at her, really looked at her, the way you look at something you have been seeing without seeing for too long and are now trying to correct. She looked back at him. Hi, he said. Hi, she said. He sat down. The waiter appeared. They ordered. For a while they talked about ordinary things. The house. The fence that had finally been repaired. A movie she had seen without him. A restaurant in Naples he had read about that he wanted to take her to sometime. And somewhere in the middle of those ordinary things, without either of them marking the exact moment it happened, they stopped performing a conversation and started having one. It was not dramatic. There was no single sentence that changed everything. There were just two people at a table who had been strangers to each other for too long, remembering slowly, carefully, like coming back to a language you had not spoken in years how to actually speak. At one point, Elena said, "You seem different." He thought about how to answer that. He thought about Seoul, about the documents in the suitcase, about Victor Sterling, and the truth told at the right moment, about a small notebook he could not read and a word for a rare mushroom that grew only under very specific conditions. I had a lot of time to think, he said. Good thoughts? Useful ones. She tilted her head slightly. Tell me. So he did. Not all of it, not the business details, not the parts that needed to stay inside their particular walls, but the part that mattered. The part about walking into a room where he understood nothing, about needing someone, about what it had shown him when he looked from a distance at a life he thought he had built correctly. Elena listened. She did not fill the silences. She did not offer reassurances or perform acceptance. She just listened, the way she used to listen, the way he had forgotten she could listen. Back when they both still believed that listening to each other was the most important thing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. I stopped asking, she said. I don't know exactly when. But somewhere along the way, I decided that asking was harder than not asking. And then I stopped. And you... She paused. You stopped telling, not to hide things, just because I stopped asking. Yes, he said. That's a long time to stop. Yes. We can start again, she said. Not a question, not a reassurance. Just a statement of fact, offered with the directness of a woman who had made a decision and was saying it out loud. He looked at her. At the woman he had married when they're both young and hungry, and had not yet learned how to take each other for granted. At the woman who had sat at this table with an empty chair across from her and had said, "It's fine," and had meant something entirely different and had never said what she meant. Yes, he said, we can. Outside, the city moved past the window in its perpetual motion. Cabs and pedestrians, and the distant sound of the subway somewhere underneath everything. New York, doing what New York always did, indifferent to individual stories, containing all of them. At a table by the window, a man and a woman finished their dinner and ordered dessert, which they never usually did, and talked for another hour about things that were ordinary and things that were not, and neither of them looked at their phones. It was not a perfect ending. It was not an ending at all, really. 18 years of distance does not close over a single dinner. Old habits of silence do not disappear because someone has decided to speak, but a door that had been almost closed was open again. And sometimes that is enough to begin with. There are languages you learn from textbooks, and languages you learn from living inside them until they become part of how you think. There are things you can say directly, and things that only exist space between what two people understand together. Rafael Moro had spent his entire adult life controlling every room he walked into by controlling the language in it. He had been very good at this. It had served him well in most of the ways that mattered, and it had cost him in ways he had not seen clearly until a week in Seoul, with an interpreter he could not manage, showed him the shape of what he had built, and what the building had left out. He had been waiting, without the word for it, for someone to translate him honestly, to hear the Italian inside the English, to catch the things he said when he thought no one was listening. He had found that in a city where he couldn't speak the language, in the company of a woman he had known for 7 days, through a week of heists and documents that weren't his, and truths told into rooms where the air was thick with what no one was saying. And what he had learned, coming home, was simpler than any of it. The most important translation was not from Korean to English, or from Italian to everything else. It was from the language of habit back into the language of intention, back into actually meaning what you say, back into actually being where you are. The chair across the table was not empty anymore. That was the whole story. That was all of it. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
Let me tell you what this story was really about. Because on the surface, it looked like one thing. A powerful man, a foreign city, a woman who wasn't his wife, 2 hours at an empty table. But that was never the real story. The real story was about a man who had spent 20 years building a life so controlled, so perfectly armored, that he had slowly, without ever noticing, built himself into a kind of prison. A beautiful prison, an expensive one, but a prison nonetheless. Rafael Moro could walk into any room in the world and command it. He could read people, outmaneuver competitors, close deals that other men couldn't even get invited to. He had power, real power, the kind that takes decades to build and never comes easy. And yet, he could not have a real conversation with his wife. Not because he didn't love her, not because she didn't matter, but because somewhere along the way, both of them had made the same quiet decision. The decision to stop asking, stop telling, stop reaching across the distance. They had mistaken comfort for connection, routine for relationship. And by the time either of them noticed, the silence had been going on so long it felt normal. That is the most dangerous kind of loss. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that happens so slowly, you don't feel it happening until the chair across from you is empty, and you can't remember when it started feeling that way. Here is the first lesson. Strength is not the absence of need. The strongest people are not the ones who need nothing and no one. They are the ones who are honest enough, brave enough to recognize what they actually need, and humble enough to ask for it. Rafael Moro was one of the most powerful men in 3 countries, and it took 1 week of being completely helpless in a foreign city to show him something that 20 years of success had hidden from him. That needing someone is not weakness. It is the beginning of every real thing. Here is the second lesson. The people who tell you the truth are more valuable than the people who tell you what you want to hear. Claire Morgan did not flatter Raphael. She did not manage him or protect his ego. She listened carefully. She translated honestly. She told him when to stop talking. She told him what the room actually needed. And when she had been doing something ethically questionable, Listening to him in a language he didn't know she understood, she told him that too, even when it was risky to do so. That kind of honesty is rare. Guard it when you find it. Here is the third lesson. And this one is for every relationship you are currently inside. The most important translation in your life is not between languages. It is between what you say and what you actually mean. Between what your partner says and what they are actually asking for. Between the surface of a long relationship and everything that has slowly gone unspoken underneath it. Elena sat at that restaurant for 2 hours. Not because her husband didn't care, but because two people who once knew exactly how to speak to each other had quietly, gradually, stopped doing it. They got it back. Not all at once, not perfectly, but they chose to start again. That choice, the decision to reach back across the silence, is available to anyone. It doesn't require a crisis. It doesn't require a trip to Seoul or a week of high-stakes negotiation. It only requires one person willing to make the call. To say the honest thing, to sit at the table and actually show up. The chair doesn't have to stay empty. That is the whole lesson. That is everything this story was built to say.